The year was 830 of the Common Era, in the city of 1001 Tales, Baghdad, the heart of the Abbasid Caliphate, a metropolis teeming with life, knowledge, and secrets darker than the ink of its famed calligraphers. Within the emerald-green walls of the Caliph's palace, a world of impossible luxury existed, scented with ambergris and cooled by fountains of rosewater. Here, amidst the whisper of silk and the clinking of jeweled cups, moved the most enigmatic figures of the court, the Caliph's CATAMITES, the ghilman. They were called the pearls of the harem, living jewels whose beauty was a testament to the Caliph's power. But were they merely beautiful boys, passive instruments of pleasure, or were they something more, a third sex navigating a treacherous world of power, art, and espionage, their lives as brilliant and as fragile as spun glass? To understand the world of these gilded youths, one must first journey into the mind of the Abbasid Empire itself, an empire that by the 9th century had reached a zenith of cultural and material splendor. This was the Golden Age, a period when Baghdad was the unrivaled center of the world, a crucible where Arab, Persian, Greek, and Indian traditions melted and reforged into a new, dazzling civilization. The caliphs, successors to the prophet, were not mere desert chieftains. They were patrons of science, poetry, and philosophy, their courts lavish theaters of power and intellect. It was from the conquered Sasanian Empire of Persia that the Abbasids inherited not just administrative models and architectural marvels, but also a taste for opulent court life, a life that included the appreciation of youthful male beauty. This was not seen through the simple lens of sin or virtue that later ages would apply, but as a complex aesthetic pursuit, a mark of sophistication and worldly power. The ghilman were more than bedfellows. They were a status symbol, as essential to a caliph's prestige as a well-stocked library or a victorious army. They were trained in letters, music, and witty conversation, expected to be as sharp of mind as they were perfect of form. The verses of poets like Abu Nuwas, who openly celebrated the allure of wine-serving boys, were not whispered in secret but declaimed in the open court, a testament to a world where desire and beauty were woven into the very fabric of high culture. This environment, rich with intellectual ferment and sensual indulgence, was the garden in which these strange, beautiful flowers were cultivated, their existence a direct reflection of the Caliphate's immense wealth and its syncretic, cosmopolitan soul. But it was a garden with deep shadows, where the price of such a life was often paid in ways that history has chosen to forget. The selection of these boys was a meticulous, almost scientific process, a human horticulture aimed at producing the perfect bloom for the caliph's pleasure gardens. They were often sourced from the far reaches of the empire and beyond, from the Turkic steppes of Central Asia, from the mountains of Georgia, or the markets of Byzantium, chosen for their fair skin, delicate features, and the promise of enduring beauty. Captured in raids, sold by impoverished families, or given as tribute, their journey to Baghdad was the first step in a total erasure of their past. Names, languages, and allegiances were stripped away, replaced by a new identity forged in the crucible of the court. They were given poetic new names: Kaukab for a star, Misrur for a joy, Yasir for a confidant. Were educated in the disciplines deemed essential for a courtier. They learned to master the intricacies of classical Arabic, to recite thousands of lines of poetry, to debate philosophy, and to play the oud with heartbreaking skill. They were taught the art of conversation, not just to amuse, but to soothe the anxieties of the most powerful man in the world, to be a placid and beautiful surface upon which the caliph could project his desires and his burdens. This was not just education, it was a profound form of indoctrination, a sculpting of the soul to match the perfection of the body. Their lives were a paradox of immense privilege and absolute powerlessness. Dressed in the finest silks, adorned with pearls and emeralds, they lived in a luxury unimaginable to the common man. Yet they were slaves, their every waking moment, their very existence, subject to the whim of their master. They were not men, nor were they women. They occupied a liminal space, a third gender defined by their unique role. This delicate balance, between being a cherished object of art and a disposable tool of state, created a psychology of constant, gnawing tension, a reality hidden behind their serene, carefully composed faces. Imagine the scene: the majlis of the Caliph al-Amin, a ruler whose name meant the trustworthy, but whose reign was defined by extravagance, and a near-pathological devotion to pleasure. The air in the grand hall is thick with the scent of burning aloes wood and heavy wine, a golden haze illuminated by 1,000 flickering lamps. The Caliph, a fleshy man with eyes that are simultaneously bored and hungry, reclines on a divan stuffed with ostrich feathers. Around him, the court is a sea of silk and intrigue, where viziers whisper plots and poets flatter for coin. And moving through this dangerous current are the ghilman, silent and graceful, their jeweled slippers making no sound on the Persian carpets. One such figure is Yasir, a youth of perhaps 17 years, whose beauty is so striking it silences conversations as he passes. He is of Circassian origin, with skin the color of cream and eyes like chips of jade. He is the Caliph's current favorite, a position of dizzying height and terrifying precarity. As he refills the Caliph's goblet with wine from Shiraz, his hand does not tremble. He has learned to master the mask of serene indifference, the essential armor of his kind. He is a musician, a poet, and a confidant, the keeper of secrets whispered in drunken stupors, the silent witness to decisions that could shatter kingdoms. He holds a unique form of power, an intimacy that even the most powerful vizier cannot access. Al-Amin, it is said, values his opinion on the composition of a new verse more than his general's advice on frontier skirmishes. But this power is illusory, a reflection in a polished mirror. It is derived entirely from the Caliph's gaze, and should that gaze shift, the mirror will surely fall and shatter. This is the tightrope Yasir walks every single moment of his life, a performance of perfection in a theater where the slightest misstep could mean oblivion. The life of a favored catamite like Yasir was a tapestry woven with threads of exquisite pleasure and chilling fear. Days were spent in the hushed, sun-dappled courtyards of the harem, a world unto itself, governed by its own complex hierarchies and unwritten rules. Here they were under the watchful eye of the chief eunuch, a figure of immense power who acted as their guardian, their teacher, and their jailer. They practiced calligraphy, studied the Quran, and engaged in contests of wit and poetry, constantly honing the skills that made them valuable. The competition was relentless and subtle, a silent war fought with a well-timed glance, a perfectly recited couplet, or a display of superior grace. Friendships were dangerous luxuries, for the boy who shared your confidence today could become your rival for the Caliph's affection tomorrow. Every other ghilman was a potential threat, a newer, more perfect face that could eclipse your own. The nights were a different realm altogether, a world of performance and peril. In the Caliph's private chambers, the mask of the artist and scholar had to be worn alongside the mask of the lover. They were expected to be attentive, imaginative, and utterly submissive, their bodies another instrument to be played by their master. They became repositories of the Caliph's darkest secrets and most fleeting fantasies. For a ruler like Al-Amin, whose appetites were legendary, these nights were long and demanding. He reportedly built special pleasure barges, shaped like lions and eagles, to drift down the Tigris with his favored boys as the only crew. But this intimacy was a poisoned chalice. It bred a dangerous illusion of influence, a belief that they were more than property. This illusion was the greatest danger of all, for it could lead a boy to forget the fundamental truth of his existence, that he was a beautiful object, and objects could be broken. The Caliph's favor was a blazing sun that nourished, but it could also scorch, and the shadows of jealousy and political intrigue it cast were long and deadly, stretching from the perfumed harem to the corridors of absolute power. The political landscape of Baghdad during the reign of Al-Amin was a viper's nest, a treacherous terrain that even the most seasoned courtier struggled to navigate. The Caliph himself, the second son of the legendary Harun al-Rashid, was seen by many as frivolous and unfit to rule, a man more interested in composing verse and indulging his senses than in the sober business of statecraft. His older half-brother, al-Ma'mun, the governor of the eastern province of Khorasan, was his opposite, a shrewd, calculating, and ambitious intellectual with a powerful army at his back. The empire was split between them, a simmering rivalry that was destined to erupt into open civil war. The court in Baghdad was a reflection of this division, a fractured mirror of loyalty and ambition. Factions coalesced around the two brothers, with viziers, generals, and governors placing their bets on who would emerge victorious. In this high-stakes game of thrones, every resource was a weapon, and every person a pawn. The Caliph's CATAMITES, seemingly insulated in their world of art and pleasure, were not exempt. On the contrary, their proximity to the Caliph made them invaluable assets. They were the eyes and ears in the ruler's most private moments, privy to his moods, his fears, and his drunken pronouncements. A word from a favored boy like Yasir could sow a seed of doubt against a vizier, or secure a promotion for a sycophantic general. They became unwilling conduits of information, their conversations and pillow talk mined for intelligence by powerful figures like the Grand Vizier, Al-Fadl ibn al-Rabi, who sought to manipulate the weak-willed Al-Amin and maintain his own power against the threat of Al-Mamun. Yasir, in his gilded cage, found himself caught in these invisible webs. Courtiers would approach him with feigned friendship, bestowing lavish gifts, all in the hope of gleaning some insight into the Caliph's mind or influencing his decisions. He was no longer just a companion, he was a political tool, a silent player in a game whose rules he barely understood and whose outcome would determine not only the fate of the empire but his own survival. As the political tensions between the two brothers, Al-Amin and Al-Mamun, escalated from a war of words to a war of swords, the atmosphere in the Baghdad palace grew thick with paranoia and dread. The conflict, which would later be known as the Fourth Fitna, or the Great Abbasid Civil War, began to cast its long, dark shadow over the city's opulent life. Reports from the east spoke of Al-Mamun's formidable army, led by the brilliant general Tahir ibn Hussein, marching relentlessly towards Iraq. In Baghdad, Al-Amin's response was characteristically erratic and short-sighted. He dismissed the threat, confident in the supposed invincibility of his capital and the loyalty of his own troops. He spent his days and nights in ever more frantic pursuits of pleasure, as if by ignoring the coming storm he could make it disappear. For Yasir and the other ghilman, this period was one of heightened anxiety. The Caliph's moods became volatile, swinging from manic festivity to deep, wine-sodden despair. His demands for entertainment grew more insatiable, his need for distraction more desperate. The poetry recitals became louder, the music more frenzied, the nights longer and more debauched. It was a carnival on the edge of a precipice. Yasir saw firsthand the denial that gripped the heart of the regime. He would watch as messengers brought grim news from the battlefront, only to be dismissed by a caliph who was more concerned with the design of a new jeweled collar for his favorite lion. He heard the whispered anxieties of palace guards and the frantic plotting of courtiers who began to see the writing on the wall. The very air, once scented with rosewater, now seemed tinged with the metallic smell of fear. The power Yasir once thought he held, the subtle influence of the favored companion, now felt utterly meaningless. What good was a perfectly composed verse when an army was at the gates? He was a creature of peacetime and prosperity, a luxury item for a secure ruler. In a time of war and crisis, his value plummeted. He and his companions were like canaries in a coal mine, their songs growing fainter as the political air grew more toxic, their beauty a stark and poignant contrast to the encroaching ugliness of civil war. They were about to discover that in the brutal calculus of power, beauty is the first and most easily discarded currency. The siege of Baghdad began in the year 812 and would last for more than a year, a protracted and brutal affair that would tear the heart out of the world's greatest city. Al-Mamun's general, Tahir, surrounded the circular walls of the city, cutting off supplies and commencing a relentless bombardment. The Baghdad that had been a byword for civilization descended into a hellscape of fire, starvation, and slaughter. The grand palaces became fortresses, the fragrant gardens turned into battlegrounds, and the once bustling streets became killing fields. For the inhabitants of the Caliph's palace, the world shrank to the confines of its fortified walls. The life of decadent luxury evaporated overnight, replaced by the grim reality of survival. The cellars once overflowing with wine and exotic foods grew barren, and the specter of hunger, a thing once only imagined in poetry, became a gnawing reality. The ghilman, including Yasir, were stripped of their finery and their purpose. There were no more poetry contests, no more musical evenings, no more witty philosophical debates. Their silks were traded for rough-spun cloth, their jeweled cups replaced with crude clay bowls. Their carefully cultivated skills were now utterly useless. They were no longer jewels, they were just more mouths to feed, liabilities in a besieged fortress. The psychological toll was immense. These were youths who had been conditioned for a life of aesthetic perfection and serene beauty, suddenly thrust into a world of visceral horror. The sound of the oud was replaced by the crash of catapult stones against the walls and the screams of the dying. The scent of incense was overwhelmed by the stench of filth, disease, and death. Yasir, who had once navigated the subtle intrigues of the court, now had to navigate a world of brute force and primal fear. He saw courtiers he had once served wine to turn into savage opportunists, hoarding food and betraying friends. The carefully constructed artifice of his life had been shattered, revealing the terrifyingly simple truth beneath. In the end, there is only survival. His beauty, once his greatest asset, was now a curse, attracting the predatory gaze of desperate guards and starving officials. The gilded cage had become a death trap, and the once prized canary was now just another creature fighting for its next breath in a world that had gone mad. As the siege wore on, the Caliph Al-Amin himself began to unravel. Confined to his palace, cut off from his empire, and betrayed by many of his commanders, he retreated further into a world of delusion and despair. His authority crumbled, and the palace devolved into a state of near anarchy, controlled by whichever faction of the army had been paid most recently. For the ghilman, this collapse of central authority was a terrifying development. Their sole protector, the Caliph, was now a figure of pity and ridicule, a prisoner in his own home. Without his authority to shield them, they were exposed to the brutal whims of the soldiers and mercenaries who now roamed the palace corridors. Their status as the Caliph's property, once a form of protection, now marked them as targets. They were symbols of the despised, decadent regime that had brought this suffering upon the city. Yasir witnessed horrors that would forever scour his soul. He saw some of his companions, boys he had shared verses and music with, fall victim to the casual brutality of the soldiers, their beauty offering them no defense against sword points and starvation. Others, in a desperate bid for survival, attached themselves to powerful military commanders, trading their bodies for a crust of bread and a measure of protection. The delicate hierarchy of the harem was obliterated, replaced by the brutal hierarchy of force. The line between a cherished catamite and a common prostitute was erased in the face of starvation. Yasir survived through a combination of luck and a desperate animal cunning he never knew he possessed. He learned to make himself small, to become invisible, to erase the very qualities of grace and beauty that had once defined him. He hid in forgotten corners of the sprawling palace complex, stealing scraps of food and avoiding the roving gangs of soldiers. His once soft hands became calloused. His poet's mind focused on a single, grim imperative: to live until the next sunrise. He was no longer Yasir, the Caliph's comfort. He was a ghost haunting the ruins of a fallen world, a living testament to the fact that when empires clash, it is the most beautiful and fragile things that are the first to be trampled underfoot. The end for Caliph Al-Amin came not with a bang, but with a pathetic whimper, an ignominious final act to a life of indulgence. In the late summer of 813, with the city of Baghdad largely in the hands of Tahir's forces and his own palace on the verge of being overrun, the Caliph made a desperate attempt to flee. He reportedly tried to escape by boat on the Tigris River, clutching his favorite pearl-encrusted prayer mat, a symbol of his disconnect from reality until the very end. He was quickly captured by Tahir's soldiers, dragged through the streets he once ruled, and unceremoniously executed. His head was mounted on the Anbar Gate of Baghdad, a gruesome message to the populace that the era of Al-Amin was over, and a new master, Al-Mamun, now reigned. The news of the Caliph's death spread through the ravaged palace like wildfire. For the few remaining inhabitants, including the survivors among the ghilman, it was a moment of profound and terrifying uncertainty. Their master was dead. The structure of their lives, however brutal it had become, was gone. They were now masterless slaves in a city controlled by a conquering army. What would become of them? Would they be slaughtered as remnants of the old regime, enslaved by new masters, or simply cast out into the devastated city to fend for themselves? Yasir, hearing the news, felt not grief for the man who had owned him, but a cold, hollow fear for his own future. The man whose gaze had defined his entire existence was gone. The world he had been so carefully trained for had ceased to exist. He was adrift, a piece of human flotsam in the wreckage of a sunken kingdom. The immediate aftermath was chaos. Tahir's soldiers, flush with victory, looted what was left of the palace. In the turmoil, Yasir and the other surviving Catamites scattered. Some were captured and taken as personal spoils by victorious officers, their fate to continue in a different, perhaps harsher, form of servitude. Others, like Yasir, managed to slip away into the labyrinthine, war-torn streets of Baghdad, their once famous faces now gaunt and unrecognizable. The jewels of the Golden Knights were now just beggars in a city of ashes, their past a secret they had to bury in order to survive. The fall of Al-Amin and the victory of his brother Al-Mamun marked a pivotal turning point in the history of the Abbasid Caliphate. Al-Mamun, a patron of the rationalist Mu'tazila school of thought, ushered in an age of intellectual inquiry and scientific advancement that would become the high-water mark of the Islamic Golden Age. His court was one of scholars, astronomers, and philosophers, not poets of debauchery and troops of dancing boys. The sensuous, often decadent, Persian-influenced court culture that had reached its zenith under his father, Harun al-Rashid, and had descended into parody under his brother, Al-Amin, was deliberately suppressed. A new, more sober, and intellectually rigorous tone was set. For the institution of the court Catamite, this was the beginning of a long, slow decline. While the practice did not disappear overnight, its overt celebration and central role in the caliph's court life were curtailed. The kind of explicit, lavish patronage that Al-Amin had showered upon his favorites became a political liability, a symbol of the failed and corrupt regime he had replaced. The figure of the powerful, influential ghilman, the artist courtier confidant, began to fade from the center stage of Abbasid politics. What happened to the individual boys, the scattered remnants of Al-Amin's harem, is largely lost to history. Their lives were deemed too insignificant, too shameful to be recorded by the chroniclers of the new, more pious era. For a boy like Yasir, survival in the post-siege Baghdad would have meant a complete reinvention of the self. He would have had to shed every last vestige of his former life, to bury the poetry, the music, the soft grace that had been his identity. He would have needed to learn a trade, to become a laborer, a merchant's assistant, or perhaps even a soldier, his delicate hands learning the feel of rough tools or a sword's hilt instead of the strings of an oud. The greatest challenge would have been to erase the memory of what he had been, to silence the verses that would bubble up unbidden, to forget the scent of ambergris and the feel of silk. His past was not just a memory but a mortal danger. To be recognized as one of Al-Amin's jewels would be to be branded with the shame of a fallen dynasty, inviting scorn, retribution, or exploitation. The secret life of the caliph's Catamite had to become a secret kept even from himself. He had to become a ghost, not of the palace, but of his own history. Imagine Yasir, now a man in his 30s, a decade after the Great Siege. Perhaps he is a rug merchant in a dusty corner of the Baghdad souk, his face weathered by the sun, his eyes holding a depth of sorrow that no customer could ever guess. His hands, no longer delicate, are now skilled at judging the quality of wool and tying intricate knots. He has a wife, children, a life of mundane, reassuring reality. He has successfully buried the boy who was once named Yasir. But there are moments when the ghost returns. A certain melody played on a reed pipe in the marketplace might transport him back to the perfumed halls of the palace. The sight of a handsome youth with an arrogant bearing might stir a phantom feeling of rivalry and fear. In these moments, the carefully constructed walls of his new life threaten to crumble. He is haunted by the memory of beauty and terror, of a power that was not power, of a life that was not a life. He carries within him a silent, unwritten history of the Abbasid court, a history of flesh and desire, of art and exploitation, a history that the official chronicles, with their focus on battles and treaties, would never record. His story is a powerful reminder that history is not just the story of kings and conquerors, but also the story of those who lived in their shadows, the beautiful, the damned, and the forgotten. Their silence speaks volumes, a testament to the brutal complexities of power and the resilience of the human spirit in the face of annihilation. The broader legacy of the court Catamite in the Islamic world is a complex and often contested subject. The open, almost celebratory culture surrounding the ghilman during the early Abbasid period did not last. As the caliphate's political power fragmented and more orthodox interpretations of Islam gained prominence, the practice became more clandestine, more associated with decadence and moral decay. The figure of the beautiful boy, once a subject for sublime poetry, became a symbol of sin and corruption in the eyes of later moralists and historians. Yet, the aesthetic ideal they represented never truly vanished. It seeped into the broader culture, influencing Persian and Ottoman art and literature for centuries. The motif of the beautiful, wine-serving youth, the saki, became a central trope in Sufi mystical poetry, where the boy was transformed into a symbol of divine beauty and the love for him a metaphor for the soul's yearning for God. This was a remarkable act of sublimation, taking a practice rooted in worldly power and carnal desire and elevating it into the realm of the spiritual. It was a way for the culture to grapple with a part of its past that had become uncomfortable, to sanitize it and give it a new, more acceptable meaning. Thus, the memory of the real boys, the Yazirs of the Abbasid court, was doubly erased. First, they were erased by the immediate political shift that made them symbols of a disgraced regime. Then, they were erased by a cultural transformation that turned their reality into a metaphor. They were lost in the transition from historical fact to literary symbol. What we are left with is a profound historical silence, a void where their voices should be. They left behind no memoirs, no letters, no accounts of their own experiences. Their lives are known to us only through the gaze of others, the poets who desired them, the chroniclers who condemned them, and the rulers who owned them. To uncover their story is to engage in an act of historical imagination, to read between the lines of official records and to listen for the faint echoes of their music in the silent halls of the past. Theirs is a story that forces us to confront the uncomfortable intersections of beauty and exploitation, of art and power, of personal survival and historical erasure. The tale of the Caliph's CATAMITES is not just a morbid curiosity from a distant past, it is a timeless and unsettling reflection on the human cost of power. It serves as a stark reminder that the grandest civilizations are often built upon foundations of hidden exploitation, and that the most celebrated ages of cultural flourishing can also be ages of profound personal suffering for those deemed expendable. The story of Yazir is the story of anyone whose identity and worth are defined by the powerful, whose life is contingent on the whims of another. It speaks to the terror of being seen only as an object, a tool, or a symbol, rather than as a human being. The gilded cage, whether it is a caliph's harem in 9th century Baghdad or a modern-day context of economic or social bondage, is still a cage. The fundamental dynamics of power, desire, and dehumanization are constants in the human story. Furthermore, their erasure from the historical record is a lesson in how history is written. The powerful write the chronicles, and in doing so, they often silence the voices of those they have used and discarded. The story of the ghilman forces us to ask what other stories have been lost, what other lives have been deemed too shameful, too insignificant, or too inconvenient to be remembered. It challenges us to look beyond the grand narratives of empires and battles and to seek out the quieter, more personal histories that lie buried beneath. It is an invitation to listen for the whispers of the ghosts of history, to acknowledge their existence, and to understand that their forgotten lives are an integral part of our shared human past. Their beauty was a currency in a brutal market, their art a shield against terror, and their survival a silent act of rebellion. To remember them is to reclaim a piece of a more complete and more honest human story. The world of the Abbasid court, with its blend of high intellect and sensual indulgence, presents a challenge to our modern, often simplistic categories of understanding human relationships and sexuality. It was a world that could simultaneously produce breathtaking advances in mathematics and medicine, while institutionalizing a form of sexual slavery. It could celebrate the beauty of the male form in sublime poetry, while denying the possessors of that beauty any fundamental human agency. This paradox is not a sign of hypocrisy as much as it is a sign of a radically different cultural framework, one that did not compartmentalize life in the way we do now. Power, art, religion, and desire were all part of a single, intricate tapestry. The caliph's power was absolute, and therefore his desires, aesthetic or carnal, were seen as a natural extension of that power, to be fulfilled as a matter of statecraft and prestige. There was no separate private sphere where morality was judged differently. The beauty of a ghilman was a public good, a reflection of the health and splendor of the empire itself. To judge this world by contemporary standards is an exercise in anachronism, yet to ignore its brutal aspects is to engage in a romanticism that is equally false. The challenge is to see it in its own context, to understand the ideologies that made it possible, without excusing the human cost. The story of Yasir is not just about sexual exploitation, it is about the commodification of the human spirit in its entirety. His training was not merely to serve the caliph's lust, it was to serve his soul, to be his intellectual companion, his artistic muse, his emotional regulator. This totalizing form of ownership, where one person's entire being is cultivated to please another, is a profound form of violence, regardless of the material luxuries that accompany it. It is the erasure of the self, the hollowing out of a human being to create a beautiful, pleasing vessel. It is this aspect of their story that resonates most powerfully across the centuries, a chilling exploration of what can happen when human beings are treated as exquisite objects. As we delve into this forgotten corner of history, we are forced to confront the dark side of beauty. Throughout human history, beauty has been a source of power, but it has also been a terrible vulnerability, particularly for those in subservient positions. The story of the Caliph's CATAMITES is an extreme example of this dynamic. Their beauty was the reason for their selection, their education, and their luxurious lives. It was also the reason for their enslavement, their objectification, and the constant precarity of their existence. It was a gift that was also a curse, a form of wealth that could not be banked, a power that was entirely dependent on the perception of others. This paradox lies at the heart of their tragedy. They were elevated for a quality they did not create, and they could be destroyed the moment that quality was deemed to have faded or was eclipsed by a newer, more fashionable version. This turned their lives into a desperate race against time, a constant battle against the natural processes of aging and the shifting tastes of their master. It fostered an environment of intense jealousy and rivalry, where the only path to security was to ensure the insecurity of others. This weaponization of beauty, turning it from a personal attribute into a competitive tool for survival, is a recurring theme in the courts of the powerful throughout history. From the concubines of the Chinese emperors to the royal mistresses of Versailles. The story of the ghilman is perhaps the most refined and institutionalized expression of this cruel dynamic, where an entire class of people was created whose sole purpose was to be beautiful, and whose entire existence was predicated on the fleeting and arbitrary nature of that beauty. It is a testament to the human capacity for both the appreciation of sublime aesthetics and the perpetration of profound cruelty, often in the very same breath. The psychological landscape of the ghilman is a realm we can only speculate upon, a territory of profound and unresolved contradictions. What did it mean to be trained to see yourself as a work of art? It may have instilled a sense of pride and immense self-worth, a belief in one's own specialness and superiority. To be the object of the caliph's desire, to be praised in poetry, to be adorned in jewels, these were powerful affirmations of value. Yet this pride must have coexisted with the constant, terrifying knowledge of its own fragility. The pride was borrowed, the value was assigned, and both could be revoked at any moment. This would have created a psyche in a state of permanent tension, a fragile ego constantly seeking validation while simultaneously fearing its withdrawal. The relationship with the caliph, the master, would have been a complex cocktail of emotions: fear, reverence, resentment, and perhaps even a form of love, a phenomenon akin to what we now call Stockholm Syndrome. The master was the source of all pain and all pleasure, the arbiter of life and death. He was a figure to be placated, charmed, and manipulated for survival, but he was also the center of their universe, the sun around which their small planets revolved. To feel his favor was to feel warmth and life. To lose it was to be cast into outer darkness. This intense dependency would have surely warped any capacity for normal human connection, making authentic relationships with their peers almost impossible. Every other boy was a mirror reflecting their own precariousness, and a potential rival who must be defeated. It was a world that systematically dismantled the possibility of solidarity and replaced it with a corrosive, all-consuming jealousy. The only true intimacy was with the master, an intimacy that was by its very nature unequal, non-consensual, and ultimately dehumanizing. The mind of the catamite was a gilded prison, as inescapable as the physical walls of the harem. The end of this system, or rather its transformation, did not bring liberation in a simple sense. When the caliphate's power began to wane and its territories to fracture, the grand imperial court with its lavish budgets and vast slave-procuring networks began to shrink. Local dynasties and military strongmen, the new centers of power, continued the practice on a smaller scale. More significantly, the rise of Mamluk dynasties, particularly in Egypt, saw a militarization of the ghilman system. Turkic slave boys were still imported, but their training shifted from the artistic to the martial. They were no longer being prepared to be poets and lovers, but to be elite soldiers and commanders. This Mamluk system would eventually lead to a remarkable historical irony. These slave boys, trained in the arts of war and governance, would grow so powerful that they would overthrow their masters and establish their own sultanates. It was a strange and violent form of emancipation, where the slave C-suite seized control of the entire corporation. But this was not the fate of the Yassirs, the soft, beautiful boys of the Abbasid pleasure palaces. Theirs was a different trajectory. They were a luxury product of a specific moment of immense wealth and a particular syncretic culture. As that moment passed, the demand for them waned. They were not soldiers, they could not seize power. Their only skill was to please, and when the men they were trained to please were gone, they had nothing. Their legacy is not one of rebellion or political triumph, but one of silence and cultural absorption. They flowed back into the general population, their stories forgotten, their identities erased. Their only echo is in the poetry they inspired, a poetry that would itself be transformed and repurposed, its carnal origins obscured by layers of mystical interpretation. They were the victims of a system that was too successful, too refined in its objectification, leaving them with no pathway out except to disappear. We must ask ourselves why this story feels at once so alien and so uncomfortably familiar. It is alien in its specifics, the caliphs, the harems, the institutionalized nature of it all. But it is familiar in its archetypal patterns. The exploitation of the young and beautiful by the old and powerful is a story that repeats itself in endless variations across all cultures and all times. The promise of a life of luxury and influence in exchange for subservience is a bargain that is still struck in the corridors of corporate power, in the political arena, and in the entertainment industry. The story of the ghilman is a distilled, high-contrast version of a dynamic that exists in more subtle shades all around us. It is the story of vulnerability being marketed as a commodity, of people being turned into brands, their worth measured by their desirability to a powerful consumer. The pressure to maintain a facade of perfection, the constant fear of being replaced by a newer model, the psychological toll of living a life that is a performance for the benefit of others, these are not unique to 9th century Baghdad. The technologies of objectification have changed, but the fundamental impulse remains. By examining this extreme historical example, we are given a lens through which to see the more insidious forms of exploitation that exist in our own world. It allows us to recognize the patterns, to understand the mechanisms of power and desire, and to question the ways in which our own society assigns value to human beings. The story of the Caliph's CATAMITES is not, therefore, a mere piece of historical trivia. It is a mirror, and looking into it may reveal more about ourselves than we are comfortable with. It is a timeless parable about the soul-destroying nature of being a beautiful thing in a world of powerful men. Ultimately, the tale of the Caliph's CATAMITES forces us to contemplate the very nature of history and memory, what is remembered and what is forgotten. The names of the Caliph Harun al-Amin al-Mamunari recorded in every textbook, their battles, their architectural achievements, their political decisions are the stuff of official history. But the names of the boys they owned, the Yassirs, the Kaukabs, the Miswers are almost entirely lost, whispers in the margins of poetic fragments. History, as it is traditionally written, is the story of the masters, not the slaves. It is the record of those who held the pen, not those whose lives were written upon. To reconstruct a story like this is an act of defiance against this historical silence. It is to insist that the lives of the seemingly powerless have meaning and deserve to be known. It is to argue that the story of an empire is incomplete without the stories of those who lived in its most hidden and private chambers. Their lives reveal the true cost of the splendor, the human price of the Golden Age. They are the spectral figures at the feast, and their silent presence challenges the official narrative of glory. Their story is a testament to the fact that the most profound truths of an era are often not found in its grand monuments or its epic chronicles, but in the fragile, forgotten lives of those who were consumed by its greatness. They were the jewels of the Golden Knights, and like all jewels, their brilliance was meant to be admired, but their substance, their story, their humanity was meant to be ignored. By remembering them, we perform a small act of historical justice.